Hello and welcome to the India Today Business Today studio here at the World Economic Forum in Davos. It's day 4 and I'm joined by a very special guest, Narendran. He's the Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of Tata Steel, one of India's largest steel producers, one who understands the economy of this country and also the geopolitics that affects the Indian economy. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to ask some specific questions, but let's get the macro backdrop set into this conversation. Last 3 years, 4 years, whenever we have these conversations, the overall geopolitical uncertainty, first it was COVID, then supply shock, then something else, and now, of course, the Trumpian trade order. Amidst all of this, as an Indian CEO, how do you see the current situation and how are you yourself coping up with this uncertain business environment?
Thanks Siddharth for having me on the show. No, I think it's a pretty interesting period of time that we're going through, and I think it's permanently changed the way you look at supply chains. Because
permanently, absolutely.
Yeah, because over the last 100 years you optimized particularly the physical flow supply chains. The manufacturing supply chains, you optimized it on cost. Over the last 7-8 years you started optimizing it on CO2, and now we're optimizing based on trade actions. And particularly if you look at capital intensive businesses like ours, you can't take investment decisions based on what's the outlook for the next 2, 3, 4 years, right? You build a steel plant, you expect it to run for at least 20 years.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think it's increasingly become important to build resilience into your supply chains. In an ideal world, if you have locally sourced raw material and local markets, that's the safest supply chain that you would have. And countries like India, which have a large domestic market, are well positioned. And India is also rich in many input materials. So I think India is reasonably well positioned, but countries which don't have a large market or countries which don't have any input materials are the ones which are going to struggle.
One quick follow-up. The world of just-in-time, the global trade order led to that. You could be manufacturing in one place, but the inputs could be flying in virtually through courier 12 hours before that. Has that now also changed permanently?
Yeah, because again, people are looking at localization, if not within a country, within a geography. So, it started with the US building walls. Europe is also building walls now. Europe is trying to make sure that it protects industry within Europe. What we call Atmanirbharta in India is being called strategic autonomy in other geographies, but the philosophy is the same. You have to first take care of yourself because you can't depend on global trade flows, in this very volatile environment.
Might is right being the leitmotif of US trade policy. Is this a permanent rupture, or do you see that once we get a deal done and also with the European Union, the tariff related impact across industry, I'm not only talking about your sector, will kind of be fully dealt with?
I think what's certainly happening, and we saw evidence of that over the last few days and weeks, there is certainly a realignment of trade flows. You saw what happened between Canada and China. You're looking at EU taking more interest in closing the trade deal with India. So I think people are all, just like we say, we used to de-risk China, now we're also de-risking US in some sense of the term, right?
Very good.
Yeah, so everyone is developing alternate markets. I think Mark Carney in his speech also talked about that, right? You have to build your own alliances, you have to take care of your interests as a nation, and hence build partnerships, based on, you may not agree on everything, but there may be some things that you agree with some countries and you use that to build relationships with those countries.
Yeah, and as long as the risk is acceptable, you continue to. A broader question, for the last 20 years, we have seen multiple crises impacting, and every crisis suggests to me that India responds. And while some people are saying that you are responding after a crisis, the fact is we respond, we somehow make it. Is that also playing out similarly, that we have a trade-related crisis and as a consequence, all of a sudden we have multiple engagements, conversations? Parallelly and separately, we are having reforms in the past year, 2026, we hope for many more. So do you think this is a response that is befitting the situation?
It's a bit like in organizations as well. You're constantly changing and improving. But a crisis sometimes is a good opportunity to accelerate the process of change. And I think, even if you look at 1990, 1991, what triggered this journey for India was a crisis, right? So I think, as they say, you should never waste a crisis. And I think India has probably not wasted a crisis. It continues to change, but sometimes accelerate when there are provocations like this.
Absolutely. Let's turn the outlook to the steel sector. 2025 has been a decent year, one would imagine, on the back of both domestic impulses and what is happening externally. Give us a sense of your own demand outlook for the current year and how is it likely to pan out?
Yeah. So, there are a few things happening in the steel industry which impacts us. One is, of course, given our footprint in Europe, we are impacted by the trade issues between US and Europe, which we never thought would be there, right? Yeah. So, and the supply chains were built on the assumption that there will never be a problem between the US and EU, right? And UK as well. So now we have a 25% duty on UK and 50% on Netherlands from where we used to send steel. So there is that part of it which is obviously disruptive for us. But the demand in Europe is starting to look slightly better because Europe is also going to spend a lot more on infrastructure and defense. In India,
they do have some lessons that they have learned in the recent past.
Yeah. So even if you look at Germany, who have traditionally been very tight on their purse strings, opening up and saying they'll spend €1 trillion, which is a lot. India has been blessed with good demand because of the actions of the government and the focus on infrastructure, etc. But it's not been a great year from a profitability or pricing point of view because we've all been impacted by what's happening in China. Yeah. And the Chinese recovery doesn't seem imminent. They are taking actions, but 5% growth is fantastic for an economy of the size of China, but still the construction industry, which has a huge impact on steel, is going to take a long time to recover. So we're seeing the impact of that on prices and margins, but we think the worst is behind us, and hopefully going forward we'll see better times.
And what would you term as the point of recovery?
I think it's starting to happen already because what has been happening in China is while the production has been dropping, the consumption has been dropping even more. But the exports, while it's still at a very high level, seems to have stabilized at 110, 120 million tons. The anti-involution policy announced by the government, hopefully will have an impact. We are still waiting for, details which will give us some more optimism. But at least they're pointing in towards a direction where they are working on domestic consumption, which is good for the world because one thing which I want to highlight also, it's not just steel. I mean, you look at China's trade surplus, you look at what they call indirect steel exports. They've exported more products consuming steel than they've exported steel. So whether it's 8 million cars or whether it is equipment, construction equipment. So I think what the steel industry faced over the last 10 years, 15 years because of excess capacity in China, I think a lot of user industries and consuming industries are going to see the same impact. So I think as a government, as a country, we need to take a more holistic, multi-sectoral, long-term view.
Absolutely. This is a very, very significant point that you make. Since you mentioned Europe, two quick points. Yeah. In terms of the profitability impact on account of that disruption, what can you share with us?
So basically, it used to be 10% of our volumes from Europe to the US, but it used to be about 20% of our profits. So it had a big impact. Of course, the good thing is in Europe, actions are being taken to protect Europe from unfairly priced imports. So there is an announcement of quotas which the European Union has made. There's also the carbon border adjustment mechanism kind of kicking in. So we've seen steel prices starting to move up in Europe, also reflecting the potential demand because of the investments that have been announced. So while we've taken a hit because of the US trade, I think there would be some actions which mitigate that impact.
You mentioned another point that brings me to my next question, which is the search for new markets. When the tariffs hit us, that was supposed to be something that would be done across sectors. Now, obviously, it can't be equal across sectors. Can you talk about your company and your, the steel sector of how that is exploring new markets?
So, like I said earlier, as a company, we are trying to maximize sales within the domestic markets that we are in. Right? That's the best way for us to build supply chain resilience. So if you look at Europe, we're trying to maximize the sales in Europe, depend less on export markets, maybe 10% exports, and that's about it. Similarly for India, right? We've anyway traditionally exported 10% or less. So I think that's something we are working on. That means you have to work harder in the domestic markets to, keep selling the volumes that you produce. Otherwise, I think there are markets emerging. The Middle East is doing quite well. Africa, again, is a continent which is being dominated by the Chinese in many ways, and I think India, given the roots that India has because of the diaspora there, I think, there are Indians in pretty much many African countries, and that's something we should certainly leverage.
But since you spoke about that, where is this domestic demand coming from, or where would it in turn absorb your extra efforts there? Because private capex is something that's been debated for long. Give us a sense.
Yeah. So the domestic demand, the biggest consumer of steel in the domestic market is infrastructure and construction. There, if I were to split it into four parts, the infrastructure side is strong, industrial side is strong because a lot of investments in supply chains, warehouses, etc. The commercial side is getting better because of the GCCs. The residential is a bit mixed, because it's a bit more sentiment driven. Auto is looking good. Railways has continued to spend a fair amount of money. I think the demand side is quite strong. I think what probably needs to be looked at, and the RBI has worked on it, is a liquidity. And particularly if you look at the payments to the MSME sector, also payments from various state governments, I think that's been a bit sluggish. And that has impacted offtake a bit in the MSME sector. And they typically consume 40% of the steel, in different ways across sectors. So that's a matter of concern a bit. But, otherwise, pretty much most domestic consuming segments are good. Rural markets are good, much better than it was 2 years back. Tractors are doing very well. Motorcycles are doing well. So we see across the board things are much better. So that's positive.
Absolutely. And that point about states that you make is very, very important, because we've also seen, viewers, in parallel a rise in welfare spending. Now, this is not to criticize welfare spending. There are massive needs that our country has and our people have, but that also has second round impact, as we can see. One final point as I let you go. What would you highlight as the topmost sort of reform measure that you are looking forward to, which could keep the growth momentum ticking and in fact even take it much faster ahead?
I think a lot of action is already being taken. Continue to spend on infrastructure. I think that is extremely important. I always say that we can deliver competitiveness within our factory gates, but a lot of the competitiveness outside the factory gates depends on infrastructure, depends on the cost of doing business, which it still is quite significant in India and varies from state to state. So I think that's an area of reform both at the center and the state level, particularly for manufacturing. Apart from that, I think, certainly a lot of the work which is happening at the top needs to percolate at the operating level, because again, a lot of people deal with the government at the local district level, at the local official level, so somewhere, even if the intent is right at the top, by the time it percolates down to the bottom, the experience is not necessarily the same as the intent, right? And I think that's something which, again, the MSME sector struggles with. Large companies like us can deal with it, but I think if you really look at India as a very attractive place to invest in, and for us to have a greater share of manufacturing in the overall GDP, these day-to-day issues need to get addressed. Policy issues, I think a lot of it is getting addressed.
Absolutely, and that is the nitty-gritty that will perhaps make that fundamental difference to the next wave of growth. TV Narendran, thank you very much for your time. With that, it's a wrap on this conversation. We'll come back with more. Do stay tuned in. It gives me great honor and pleasure